Welcome to another Asana a day. Today we're going to look at Ūtthita Trikonāsana, also known as the triangle pose. I'd like to look at a couple of the interesting anatomical aspects of this pose with you. Some interesting things for me in this pose are the external rotation that happens in the hip socket with both feet connected to the earth. There are other times when we get that external rotation, but the feet are, or one foot is in the air, or you're laying down. And that affects things differently when your feet are both connected to the earth and you're moving the hip around the hip socket. So that's one thing. And then the other thing is the spinal column. The vertebral column is made up of different segments. Each segment is kind of, the bones themselves are shaped slightly differently. So the lumbar spine is, those bones are different than the thoracic spine, and the way they sit together create different potentials for movement. Ūtthita Trikonāsana takes advantage of what happens in the thoracic spine, the way those bones sit together, allowing them to have a lot of potential for side bending, as well as potential for rotation. And we'll actually find out how rotation and side bending go together. So let's just jump right into it. It would be helpful to have a sticky mat, a chair, a block, and a few blankets, or you could have a yoga bolster. And what I'd like to do first is for us to just try the pose together, and then we're going to do a few things and then come back and do the pose again. So I'm going to have us come into this in a slightly different way than might be what you're familiar with in going into the pose. Often we stand here and step the feet apart, but because of some of the things I'm going to talk about with the hips, we're going to stand at the short end of the mat. And place your hands on your hips, and we're going to step the left foot straight back out of the hip so that it stays in line with its own hip. So if you are used to doing this pose so that the heel of the front foot intersects the arch of the back foot, as if you were standing on a tightrope, I am not going to teach it that way today. We're exploring something a little bit different, so come along with me on that journey. Sometimes I like to think of it as, I have my right foot on the right half of the mat, the left foot on the left half of the mat. My right foot is in the right lane, my left foot is in the left lane. So we're going to step our left foot back, keeping it in its own lane, taking however big of a step you feel comfortable with. And of course, have a chair or a block. Should have said that first. Whatever you might need to make this pose comfortable, all right, for you and accessible. So as I step back, I'm turning my back heel in a little bit so that in relationship to that short end of the mat, my front foot is at 90 degrees and my back foot is at about a 45-degree angle, right? I don't want to turn this heel in too much. The more I turn it in, the more I start turning toward the long end of the mat. And I don't want to turn it too little. We've got the little Goldilocks thing going on here because that encourages my pelvis to face forward. So I'm just turning at about 45 degrees, and you can see if you touch your anterior superior iliac spine hip points here, they're facing kind of going in the direction of your right foot, but not quite all the way. So then with the hands on the hips, let's move in that right hip socket. Let the pelvis roll over the head of the femur, taking your torso out over the front leg. And you can place your hand either on a chair, if you're feeling a lot of resistance in this leg, or you can go lower with the block. And don't go too low just yet. Let's just feel this pose as it is. And we know, if you're familiar with this pose, that the rib cage turns away from the floor. keep your left hand on your left hip and just feel that hip is still facing the direction, kind of heading toward the floor. We are not going to pull this hip up and away from the floor. So then if things start to loosen up, you can go a little bit lower under your hand. But you don't want to go so low that you're bending your knees. And if it feels comfortable for you, you can take that top arm up. Good. And then we're going to come out of it by pushing the floor away with the feet. Lift your back heel up, bend your front knee. These are some things we've worked on in our previous videos. You might have to hop up a little bit if you took a big step, and then push down through that front heel and come back up. Let's bring our block over to the other side, and you could take your chair if the chair is a more appropriate support for you. And we're going to stand at the short end of the mat, step the right foot out of the right hip, keeping it in its own lane. And your front foot stays where it was, or you can slightly turn outward, turn the toes a little bit to the left. Right, this back foot is at a 45-degree angle. My hips are, if you find your hip points, they're kind of looking off toward the floor in the direction of that front leg. And then we find that movement of the hip socket rolling over the head of the femur bone, and you either place your hands on your chair or a block and allow the rib cage to rotate away from the floor, not the hip. Got my hand on the hip, it's staying with the left, right hip is staying with the left hip as I turn away from the floor. And as I said, explore on your own the height underneath your hand. It's making up for any tightness in your leg. It's bringing the floor up to you. And then if you like, if your shoulders feel okay with it, you can take that top arm up. Good. So we're going to come out of this from our feet. Push the floor away, pushing the floor down. We'll turn back toward that front leg, lift your back heel, and as you bend that front knee and find your power through your front heel, you can push down and bring the back leg up. Okay, so let's take a look at the thoracic spine. That's the part of the upper spine that all your ribs are attached to. The way that those bones fit together, their actual joints, their connection points, allow for a lot of side bending and a lot of rotation. So we're going to, triangle pose really takes advantage of that. It sort of emphasizes that aspect of the thoracic spine. So we're going to look at some rotation in 3 different ways, just to kind of bring more awareness to that and warm up the upper body a little bit. So let's just stand in Tadasana and try a little side bending. Just lean to one side, curl to one side, and inhale and come up, and then curl to the other side. I'm not going as deep as I possibly can. I'm just kind of enjoying side bending. And back up into the other side. And notice, it's pretty subtle. You may not really be able to be real clear about it, but just notice that when you're bending to the side, there is this little bit of rotation. So right now I'm bending to my left, and there's a slight rotation to the right. And then coming up, side bending to the right, or if you're mirroring me, you're side bending to your left. And there's a little bit of rotation to the other direction. So I'm side bending to my right, the spine slightly rotates to the left. So side bending and rotation go together. It's pretty subtle, but it does happen. And we're going to look at that now on the floor. So this is where I'm taking a stack of blankets, and you could just use a yoga bolster. If this feels really intense for you, you can go lower with just one blanket. I've got 2. And I'm going to lay down on my side, putting my rib cage over the stack of blankets, and I'm just letting my head rest on my upper arm bone. If this isn't comfortable, you could perhaps put the block under your head. And you could even take your feet apart a little bit if you'd like, or if it feels okay, you can rest them on top. Some people might want a little padding under this bottom hip here. And I'm going to take the top arm over. So we've got side bending. If you're laying on your right side, then your right side is on the blanket, your left ribs are opening up, you're side bending to the right, and then we're going to slightly turn toward the ceiling. So I'm side bending to the right, rotating to the left. And if you feel a little unbalanced and it feels better to have your feet wider apart, you can certainly do that. And just enjoying that opening. And if your neck is feeling a little unsupported here, like my head rests pretty nicely on my upper arm bone, but you could put the block or a little folded blanket under there. And again, this arm could be resting on your side, or you can put it on a block if you need to. And just breathe there. Let that top side of the rib cage, for me it's my left ribs, open up and receive the breath. And then I didn't do a huge rotation, but I'm going to turn back to the front. If your feet are apart, bring them back together. And then place your left hand on your blankets and push down. I'm kind of curling forward and letting my head hang as I come up. You could just turn to the other side. I'm going to face the camera, so I'm going to flip my setup to the other side. And that way I can also show you how you could use that block. So I'm going to put my left side of my rib cage on the blankets and let my head rest on my upper arm bone. Or do you want to have your head rest on something like that? That might feel more comfortable for some people. Okay. Then you could potentially keep your knees bent. I kind of like to stretch my legs out. It kind of opens up the whole side a little bit more. And I'm taking the right arm overhead. If this feels like too much in your shoulder, you could put your hand on a block. So I am now side bent to the left side bending, and I'm going to slightly turn away from the floor. So I'm rotating to the right. And just hanging out here, breathing, let your right ribs open up. And this can be a wonderful practice in itself. Just middle of the day, go find your yoga bolster or your stack of blankets and lay on one side and breathe, and then the other side. Letting that rib cage get some stretch and some opening. This really does help improve your breathing, actually, when the ribs are free to spread apart. Good. So we're going to turn back to level, so unrotating, derotating, and bringing the legs back together. Push down with your top hand as you bring yourself up. And we're going to move the stack of blankets out of the way. And just either stand or sit and just notice how your sides feel. So now we're going to do a little more active rotation. That was restful and supported, more of a passive opening. Here's an active rotation that I like to do that begins to strengthen the muscles that allow you to rotate, that cause the rotation. So hands and knees, and I'm going to use my left hand to push into the floor. So when you have your hands on the floor, be careful about dropping into your little finger side of the wrist. That's a more fragile joint area over there. So really press through the thumb side and the index finger side of the hand. I'm going to push the floor down with my left hand, and with my right hand I'm pretending like there's a handle here or something that I can grab, and I'm pulling it up off the floor. So as I turn to the right, my right hand is pulling away. Push the floor with your left hand and come back. We're just going to do a couple of those. Pulling the right arm up, pushing with the left, and coming back. Pulling with the right arm up, and then back. And another one. And then we'll switch. So now I'm going to push the floor with my right hand, particularly the thumb side of the hand. With my left hand, imagining there's a handle there that I'm going to pull, turning to the left, and come back. And then actively pull as you're pushing with your right hand, and come back. Pulling and coming back. You could think of this if you had a bow, like you were going to put an arrow, knock an arrow to a bow, and you're pulling that bowstring back and come back. Good. And then let's just sit back for a moment. You could stand if this bothers your knees, feet, legs, and just notice how that feels through your sides. Good. So let's, we're going to come back up to standing, and we're going to check in with the triangle pose. So some things before we jump into it I want to say about the pelvis is keeping in mind that in this pose, both feet are firmly planted on the floor. So you have a lot of power in your legs as you're moving around in your hip sockets. And we really want to protect the sacroiliac joints. Those are the joints where your hip bones meet your sacrum. And those are meant to have a little bit of mobility so that your pelvis can move as you walk. But they're mostly joints of stability, and that's because they transfer the weight of your head and your upper body into your legs and into the earth. And so those joints need to be really stable to support our bodies. So when we're in asana, we don't want to do anything to distort that stability. You do have a lot of power in your legs, and you have the potential to really kind of crank those SI joints. So if you're somebody who has hypermobile sacroiliac joints, or you have problems with the SI joints, it might be some of the ways you're working with these poses. So this is a kind of an interesting thing to check out and see how this feels. So one of the things we're going to do, and this is why we're standing at the short end of the mat, is we're going to really be conscious of the fact that the pelvis is an intact ring, right? So wherever I move, that ring has to keep its integrity, right? But the thing is I've got these legs attached to it. So if one leg turns out and the other leg turns the other way, I'm asking that pelvis to do this. And the place where it potentially can get pulled out of whack is in those sacroiliac joints. So when I'm moving my legs, I want to move my pelvis with my legs and honor that ring and keep it intact. So hopefully that's making some sense to you, unless I go into a big anatomy lesson, which I could do someday. We're just going to play with that idea of the pelvis being a ring and that it needs to move, the two hips have to move together to keep the joints healthy. So grab your chair or your block, and you could even do this if you want more support next to a dining room table. Let's say this is a very high dining room table. You would stand right next to the dining room table and move along that surface. That's a really great way to practice the pose. We're going to come up to the short end of the mat with our hands on our hips and step the left foot out of its own hip socket, staying in line with that, and turning the heel in about 45 degrees. Slightly turn, and I want you to feel this out for yourself. I can't see you, so I can't help you correct this, but slightly turn that right foot out to the right a little bit more. Play with the sensation. How does this feel? This is allowing for that external rotation in the right hip socket. And this back leg, as the heel turns in, or the heel turns in a little bit toward the midline, is allowing our pelvis to turn away from that front foot, but we are not going to, so we're not facing the front foot, but we're also not going to turn all the way to the side, which would be asking a little bit too much of this hip. So from the right hip socket, let's do a little bit of movement. Just play with the pelvis rocking back and forth over the ball of this femur joint there, femur bone. And then exhale and extend your torso out over the right leg. Find your chair or your dining room table or your hand on your block. And a little thing you can play with is find balance between the inner and outer foot, and press the ball of the big toe firmly down, press your big toe down, and try to lift your other toes up. Okay, you don't have to maintain that, but it's a nice little check-in to keep your feet working dynamically. Good. With your left hand on your hip, notice that we're keeping both hips facing in the same direction. I am not pulling my left hip away from the floor. It's turning with the right hip toward the floor. The rotation is going to come from our rib cage, which we played with earlier. So your right ribs are rolling forward as your left rib cage rolls back. Just keep your head for now in line with the center of the sternum, your breastbone, right? So we're not asking too much of the neck. We're going to keep our neck happy here. And then if it feels okay with your shoulder, if you're getting plenty of rotation from that rib cage, then you extend your left arm up for Ūtthita Trikonāsana, the extended triangle pose. And breathe. Push the floor away with your feet, push it down, strong legs. Good. And then we're going to come up by pushing the floor down. So you can bring your top hand back to your hip, push the floor with your feet as you bring yourself up, lift that back heel, and you can either hop your back foot up or just push into the floor with that right foot and bring yourself back to Tadasana. Notice how that feels. You can just switch sides, but I want to stay facing the camera, so I'm going to come over to this side. Hands on the hips, feet hip width apart, and we're going to step the right foot right out of that right hip, taking however big of a step you can take and still feel stable and comfortable, but if you take too short of a step, you really inhibit the pose. There's only so much forward or side bending that's going to happen from here. So I'm taking a step that is going to allow me to move in the pelvis, but I want it to feel stable. Over time, you can make this step bigger and bigger. Have your hands on your hips. Kind of check out where are those hip points facing. And then playing in the right hip socket, feeling the hip bone rolling over the socket, rolling over the femur. Right, so it's a ball. This is the femur and this is the socket, and it's rolling. And then we just extend that torso out over the front leg, placing your hand on your chair or your block. Checking in that this hip is agreeing with, the right hip is agreeing with the left hip. You're maintaining the integrity of the pelvic ring, and you're not trying to crack it open. You can play with the feet a little bit, as I talked about, pressing down through the ball of the big toe and the big toe, and lift your other toes up. Just notice if you're using your foot evenly. Do you crash into the inner foot? Do you crash into the outer foot? Can you balance between the two? And then from there, we're going to rotate from the rib cage, the thoracic spine, taking advantage of all that rotation we have available to us there. Bringing the left rib cage forward, the right rib cage rolling back. And if it feels comfortable to take your arm up, you can do that. If not, just keep the hand on the hip. Or if there's just too much going on for you, then you can just keep your hand on your hip. And hang out here for a few moments, just residing in the pose with ease, breathing. And then when we're ready to come up, we're going to push the floor with the feet. Push the floor away, lift your back heel up, press into your front heel to bring yourself back up. Standing in Tadasana, just notice how that feels. So from here, you could go on and do a few other standing poses. If you're done, this is all you're going to do with me today. This is where this video ends, but you might want to go ahead. I'm trying to encourage you to kind of develop your own practice. You could go to other standing poses, or you could go to Uttanasana if you're finishing up, because I just did this kind of this lateral pose from one side to the other, external rotation of my hips. I'm wanting a forward bend. So I'm just going to end with Uttanasana, standing forward bend, using a chair, or you could be at a table or a wall, depending on what your flexibility needs are calling for. Or you can use a block, so coming forward, place your hands on your block. And if you remember from some of the other videos, I'm encouraging you to keep your hips directly over your ankles and your heels, not back behind. So you've got your hands on something, so you feel confident to bring those hips right over the ankles. More weight is in the ball of the foot. If your hands are not on something and you're hanging, you might feel like you're going to do a little somersault. So you want that support. And we want the support under our hands for other reasons as well, especially if you're less flexible in your hamstrings. Having your hands on something is helping protect your lumbar spine. So we're going to draw the lower belly up into the back body. Let the chin curl in. And just get this beautiful lengthening through the whole back line. You don't have a microphone that you have to hang on to, so hopefully you're in your pose and not worrying about what's happening with me over here in my mic. All right. When you're ready to come up, place your hands on your thighs. Bend your knees and reach your hips back behind your heels. Push with the heels, still drawing the lower belly up into the back body. Push the floor away as you come up. And I hope you have a lovely rest of your day. Thanks for joining me for Ūtthita Trikonāsana. That's our asana for today. Namaste.